Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about the second volume in Péter Nádas's Parallel Stories. The second volume is called In the Very Depth of the Night, and it moves quite far from the characters and the storylines that we knew in the first volume. And like I said in the first video on this book, I'm not going to try to summarize this book. It is way too massive. There are way too many storylines to even keep track of. Never mind summarized in a quick video, nor am I trying to make an analysis of this entire part. I'm only going to focus on a couple different moments that stood out to me as being particularly important or particularly interesting. What I do want to talk about in this video though are two characters. One I don't think I mentioned, though he was in the first volume, and the other character isn't even in the first volume at all. The first is named Christoph, who his storyline is in many ways connected pretty closely to some of the storylines we looked at in the previous video and in the previous volume. And then the second character who's introduced in this volume is the architect named Madzar, whose storyline runs parallel to the other storylines in this book, of course. To start though, much of this volume focuses on the character Christophe Demain, who is, from last time, Alejos Madzar's mother's, Erna, her deceased brother's son. So he's Alejos Madzar's cousin and kind of foster brother. Alejos' mother, Erna, who we really skipped over last time, she is a fascinating character. She has all these love affairs with men and women. She actually kisses Jean-Javert, Alejos' lover from the first volume, in this taxi ride that is an immaculately interesting scene where they're both Erna and Jean-Javert in the back of a taxi. But anyways, Erna's brother was a communist, and he was actually killed by communists. And so he left a son behind who is Christophe Demain. And he is really, I think, the central character in this volume, if not the central character in most of this book. His point of view, in fact, actually switches from the third person in the first volume to the first person in this volume. So we get a much more intimate look at him. We're much more intimate with him than we are with any other character. And we're pretty intimate with other characters. But Christoph is a young man, and in this volume, we follow him as he is a young man in Budapest sometime in the early 1960s, which means that his storyline in this volume is running directly parallel to the Alejos and Jean-Javert storyline from the first volume that we looked at in pretty in-depth when Alejos and Jean-Javert are in bed together for 4 days. This storyline is running directly parallel in terms of time frame to that storyline. And this volume actually opens quite nicely, and let me just read the first couple of sentences from the first chapter called Margie Island. I've got another life. Christoph ran headlong into the bushes, flowery branches hitting him in the face. Yes, he did have another life. He was fleeing. He's running on Margie Island, which is this island that's right in the center of Budapest, right in the middle of the Danube. And it's unclear at the beginning of this chapter why he's running, who he's running from, or what he's running from. But it becomes clear quite quickly in the next few pages that he's running from two different men who are chasing him. And we quickly realize that there is, as there always is in Nadash, a very sexual, I don't even want to kind of call it an undertone because it's very overt, a sexual overtone to this scene, as Christoph is very confusedly bisexual. He has a lot of sexual confusion in this volume, and we'll look at some of it in just a minute. But he frames this whole experience of him running away as a sort of initiation into some sort of order, which I'll come back to. But it's important to realize that Margie Island is a very important religious place. There's a medieval monastery right at the center of Margie Island, and Margie Island was actually settled and kind of colonized, I guess, by the Franciscan and Dominican orders. And it was also inhabited by the Knights Hospitaller, which they are a knightly monastic community, very similar to the Knights Templar, if you've ever heard of them. But so this sense of place on Margie Island is very important, and the name of the chapter that opens this section is called Margie Island. And it's very much this liminal space between or inside Budapest. It's at the very center of Budapest, right? It's right in the middle of the city, but it's also kind of outside the city because it's on an island inside or on the Danube, right? It's between Buda and Pest, the two neighborhoods that make up Budapest. But Christoph, while running, begins thinking about these two men who are chasing him. And let me just read this very small section. They were conspirators, ready to initiate him into their most jealously guarded and dangerous secrets, but only if he first swore to uphold their principles. He probably should have turned his body over then and there, but he could not find the required submissiveness or this kind of self-abasement in himself. Yet the situation was not unpleasant, even though he was excluded and inexperienced, because the fear and trembling kept him in a constant state of excitement. He'd have liked to become completely shut up in himself, but he had to keep himself open. And so eventually he gives in to this chase and he submits himself to these men. And here begins a incredibly long orgy. And this is a homosexual orgy in which Christoph takes part in both actively and also very, very passively. Occasionally he's acting, other times he's just allowing things to be acted upon him. But he's particularly struck by this giant man, whom he just calls the Giant. And he becomes very obsessed with this man, of course. Again, everyone in this novel is always obsessing over something, usually another body, another person. And often they can't figure out exactly why they're obsessed with him. But so Christoph gives in to this carnal lust. And again, things seem to be happening to him. He doesn't seem to really know what the hell he's doing. He's just kind of allowing the situation to sweep him up and take him. But the whole scene, at least in my reading of it, reads like an initiation or a ritual into some sort of order, which is why I thought it was so important to talk about Margie Island specifically. And this orgy actually reminds me quite a bit, and very weirdly, but bear with me, of the judge in Blood Meridian, Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, who talks quite a bit about the connections between war and dancing. And for those of you who are familiar with Blood Meridian, you know that dancing is such an important motif in that novel. But for the judge, dancing and war kind of go together. For him, both of these actions are these very visceral, very bodily actions. And they're very chaotic, but they're very controlled chaos if you know what you're doing. Think about how dancing, if you're in a room full of people, like a whole group of people doing a square dance or something like that, and you have no idea what's happening, to you, it looks completely chaotic. But to the dancers, they know exactly what they're doing. And for the judge in Blood Meridian, the same thing goes for war. But this orgy scene in parallel stories, the exact same can be said for Christoph. He has no idea what's happening. Things are happening to him. People are literally picking him up and passing him around. His body, he isn't in control of his body, but he seems to be enjoying it. And this is all happening in the middle of the night, again, on this island, Margie Island. This sort of, liminal space. That phrase is just overused. That's why I'm putting in quotation marks, though. It's the perfect word, the perfect phrase to describe what this is. And this really gets at Péter Nádas's interest in queerness. And I don't think I fully made that clear in the first volume, how interested Péter Nádas is in queerness. And so this subversion of the traditional rituals that would have taken place on Margie Island are, well, queered in the queer theory sense of the word, of course. It's actually a great essay that reads this scene, particularly this orgy scene, through the lens of queer theory by a person whose name I don't even know where to begin to pronounce, but I'll link it down below. They do some really cool, close reading of this scene and this idea of this liminal space of Margie Island. It's very good, highly recommended. But Christoph's uncertainty throughout this entire section introduces this theme that will become super, super important later on for his character, which is his inability to understand who he is. Right, as I read, the first line of this entire volume is, "I've got another life." And he has these two parallel lives that are running throughout this volume. Early in this scene, we get this really quick line that gives us a glimpse of this. His beastly self worked in a system parallel to his emotional self. He has these two sides to himself. But just later on in this scene, we get a little bit more in depth. And we get this scene that I think is just worth reading in full. "I shuddered when I realized that since I was unaware of my own intentions, I must be even less aware of other people's. In our other life, something must happen to us that slips through the cracks between obstinacy and dissembling. In fact, darkness must have lurked behind everything all along, in which case, however, reality made visible must also have something behind it, and I can't get to the end of either one. I can't see their boundaries. I can't decide which of my two lives, so trickily covering each other, is the more robust one. Everyone has another life that must be kept hidden. I knew that, but in the concealed background of a life hiding behind appearances or brutality, there is yet another life, and the one I didn't know. Because while what men did to and with one another was rough, common, and brutal, the language of their communication was exceedingly refined. more complex, civilized, and flexible than spoken language, at the very same time, clear and practical. And so many characters in this novel live these double lives. There's always doubling going on between characters, but even within single characters. Again, this book is called Parallel Stories. You would expect there to be doubling everywhere, and there is. But one last thing I want to mention with Christoph's storyline is that immediately before and after this orgy, Christoph has very intense suicidal ideation. He can't stop thinking about killing himself, and he keeps going to the bridges that lead off of Margie Island and wants to jump, but every time he's stopped by something, it's often a dog that stops him, very interestingly. Won't get into that too much, but there is this explicit connection throughout this volume and throughout this book between sex and death, two things that seemingly have nothing to do with each other. But any reader of Georges Bataille will know that death and sensuality go together quite closely, at least in Bataille's sense of the world. I mentioned Georges Bataille in the last video, The Story of the Eye, and here I think his eroticism, death and sensuality, is very, very relevant. And in this work, which I haven't read all of it, to be being totally clear, I'm not a Bataille scholar or anything like that. But in this volume, he draws on people like Marquis de Sade and other people to help him link these two things, sex and death. And quite interestingly, after Christoph's orgy, when everyone is finished, everyone's gone home, at the very end of this chapter, we just get this line that I think is explicitly connecting to Bataille, talking about the two men chasing him and the giant with whom he became obsessed. These two were really vampires, in which case he no longer had any blood, and they had also sucked the marrow from his spine, and now death was happening. Their black dog had been death's harbinger. The giant from the 24-reed bill, with whom he wanted to share his entire life, had vanished, without an embrace, without a kiss, without either of them saying a single word to each other. He had no word for me, not a solitary word. From now on, an entire long life will have to be spent in death. Sex and death are constantly being shrouded in each other in this novel. Remember back to the opening scene of this entire book where the Detective Kiernost, is investigating this dead body, this corpse of a man, and he becomes sexually attracted to this corpse. These worlds, which, again, to most people to me at least, seem very different, death and sex. In the world of Nádas and in the world of Bataille, these two things they melt into each other and they're super closely linked. Now, I'm, again, not an expert on Bataille at all, really not an expert in any of this, to be honest. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'd be very, very interested if someone who has a much firmer understanding of Bataille or a queer theory who could provide a more full reading of parallel stories through this lens. So the next major character who dominates this section wasn't even mentioned in the first volume, as far as I know. His name is Alejos Madzar, and he is this architect, and we first meet him in volume 2 because he is hired by Mrs. Semzo, who is Jean Javert's landlady. Remember, she's the one who walks in on Auguste and Jean Javert having sex and just kind of stands there. She has this whole storyline to herself too, which is all very, very interesting. But Madzar is commissioned by Mrs. Semzo to help her reconstruct her house, to redesign their apartment that she lives in and to rebuild it. And they have this very long conversation, which is very, very interesting. And eventually Madzar needs to go back to his hometown, Mohawks, in order to get the appropriate wood to finish this job. But really quick, the conversation between Madzar and Mrs. Semzo is again, really long, so it's difficult to summarize. But it's, as everything is in this novel, very sexually charged as they become increasingly obsessed with each other. But Nádas also, through this conversation, sprinkles in this parallel between the architecture of this building and the history of Hungary. And throughout this novel, there is such an interest in architecture. Just like the long descriptions of physical bodies, there are all of these just incredibly long, almost encyclopedic descriptions of architecture. So someone who has a better understanding of the history of architecture or the history of art history might be able to draw more from this, but it seems that architecture, just like physical bodies, are these two material, physical things that Nádas can map on political and cultural thought. Madzar views Mrs. Semzo's home and critiques its kind of cold pre-war design, and he complains a lot about how much he hates it. I won't read any of the sections here because they're all quite long, but I'll flash two interesting parts of this conversation on the screen if you wish to see what I'm getting at here. But the final part of this volume that I think is important to highlight is when Madzar goes back to his hometown, Mohacs, he, on the boat ride there, the boat ride down the Danube, he meets with one of his childhood friends, this man named Belardi. And Belardi is actually a student of Professor Lair, who is Algosh's father. And Belardi is trying to get Madzar to join in their political movement, or at least make a donation to their political movement. And Belardi is a Nazi. And Madzar refuses to join this political movement or make a donation or anything like that on multiple fronts, but they have this very long and very detailed conversation about all sorts of different things like nationalism, race protectionism, etc., things like that. This is where Nádas's interest in Nazism and Nazi ideology and the rise of Nazism is very explicit, and it becomes more explicit in the third volume, and we'll talk about that at length in the next video. But this conversation is, again, very interesting, very long, and Belardi is trying to use all of these different political, cultural, social, and sexual arguments to try to convince Madzar. Again, there's always a sexual overtone to all these conversations. It seems that Madzar and Belardi might have had a relationship in the past. They were definitely good friends. How good of friends they were, though, is sort of unclear, but it's hinted at strongly that they have had some sort of relationship. And Belardi tries every single sophistic, rhetorical trick in the book to try to get Madzar to join, to try to seduce Madzar to Nazism. He talks about how he is both a race protectionist, but not a racist. The logic is unsound, of course. It's inherently contradictory, as almost every argument from the far right is. But the arguments made are also very seductive, and in this case. And there is this verbal duel between these two men, which again has a very sexual undertone to it that I just noted. And I should actually note that Belardi, in a later timeline, in the first volume, he is the taxi driver who is driving Lady Erna and Jean Javert to the hospital to visit Professor Lair as he's in the hospital. And actually in the third volume, we jump back to this scene and Belardi joins in this conversation in some very interesting ways. And we might talk about that in the next video, but you can kind of start to see how these characters are all sort of interrelated to one another. But I think I'm going to leave it there for now. This section was really about Christoph and his inability to figure out or come to terms with his own self, his sexuality, his personal philosophy, his inability to come to terms with who he is. And Madzar will stay a pretty central character in the next section as well. But in the next section, we also learn quite a bit about Hans von Wolkenstein, who we talked very, very briefly about in the first video. And we also learn quite a bit about Nazism. And I think the key to why Nádas is so interested in Nazism on one side and the physical body on the other side, which we'll talk about next time. But let me know what you think. Again, I'd love to know your thoughts on this entire novel, on this section specifically. And again, if anyone is more familiar with Bataille, queer theory, or any of the other kind of theories that I touched on in this video, or if you're interested in any of the parts of this section that I didn't talk about. Again, this is a sprawling book, and it's hard to touch on really any part of it that isn't just a minute detail, because there are so many minute details that are worth focusing on. Anyways, thanks for watching.